some animal has gotten killed there, which would impart a certain kind of metaphorical flavor to the compound. I know a guy who keeps it's like a medieval alchemical pharmacy. He keeps a whole part of his house devoted to collections of sort of rare and potentially for the future significant objects that he plans to install in such objects over the course of time. Anyway, so we have these two interacting types of substances within the cauldron itself. But then we also have packets attached to the outer surface of a nganga, and these may contain further instructions concerning specific works, trabajos, that the Nfumbi is to perform at the bidding of the palero or his clients. And the residue, and it also will sort of contain the residue of animal or other sacrifices with which nganga is remunerated for its services. And these gradually build up and often overflow the cauldron itself, spilling out into veritable ritual landscapes that can come to take up entire rooms. Now, these landscapes, in a sense, have their own depositional logics and histories, and they present a materially accreting record of mystical interactions between the Nfumbi and its human master. It's kind of sort of the congealed result of an ongoing dual biography, if you will. So the resulting tableaus mole may be said to exemplify, from maybe an archaeological point of view, cultural biographies of sorts. Heterogeneous things and substances traveling along and sometimes across various social pathways of valorization and appropriation, such as commodification, extraction from nature, theft, and so on, and towards their subsumption in and by the nganga. Yet the biography they come to document is neither just one of things in social motion, nor one that merely chronicles the nganga's owner and master's agency and mystical pursuits. It involves more than one socially personified agent, only one of whom, namely the palero, is a human being. All the while it does so, it also scrambles Western common sense ontological divisions, such as those between persons and things, life and death, past and present. While a Nganga, for example, is fed with his owner's blood, initiation into the cult of Nganga likewise involves rubbing some of the Nganga's contents into small wounds cut into the future palero's skin, rendering the Nganga and its owner the co-constitutive parts of a supra-individual relation. Such relations ramify outward by assimilating actors and entities on both sides of the divide between the living and the dead. Just as new initiates literally become consubstantial with the Nganga, so will a palero seed their new Nganga objects for these initiates with parts of the contents of his own Nganga, which in turn had once been charged with elements deriving from a pre-existing Nganga. So what this all constitutes is a sort of a pattern that cascades across time and social space and does so on, conceptually both sides of the grave. Not surprisingly, the resulting hybrid, but of course we have to ask ourselves, hybrid from whose perspective? But not surprisingly, that hybrid also melts down objectifiable chronologies. Here, the coincidence of the verb montar for mounting Nganga and being mounted by the Nfumbi in possession trance is not at all incidental. Different from Laturian actants like lactic bacteria or high-speed trains, or Ingold's emergent human object worlds, the Nfumbi does not merely generate networks, entanglements, and affordances. it has a will of his or her own, subordinate to that of the Palero to some extent, but prone to rebellion, and so always potentially in need of control and demanding of active confrontation over the course of the Palero's biological lifespan. At the same time, the Nganga acts in the world at large, being sent, or rather than Fumbi, being sent on mystical errands to actively interfere with the lives and material circumstances of the Palero and his or her mortal peers. In all respects, it is decidedly not a thing. But then again, it is that too. Not being a Palero myself, I have little choice but to approach Ngangas as the notionally awesome and agentive, but otherwise smelly and rather scary material excrescences of my Palero interlocutor's ritual practice. The detritus and material remains very much now in an archaeological sense of an alien life world. From that point of view, and it is one echoed in the ethnography of Western Central Africa, to where Afro-Cuban Ngangas have been rather consistently traced, from that point of view, a Nganga object might be read as a grave, and the process of its montaje, as putting together, as one of entombment. The deliberate and methodical burial of matter of human, animal, and other origins, so as to secure a time-transcending form of mystical charge. But the deposits so constituted by Nganga objects are hardly readable as tombs in any conventional archaeological sense. And this is as it should be. After all, Paleros decisively don't see themselves as depositing stuff. They make things, and not just that. They bring beings into being. Indeed, as Charles Wetley, then, during my first fieldwork in Miami, the chief medical examiner of Dade County, told me a long time ago, taking confiscated Nganga objects apart will yield little information beyond the government-mandated efforts at identifying the human remains it contains. So, whenever the police in Miami find such objects, of course, if a skull is in there, the medical examiner's office is called in, then it has to be determined whether it's of Native American origin. And if that's not the case, because then NACPRA would, be, employed, then it has to be ascertained whether it's, what the origin of the skulls is. And interestingly, I have no idea of, had no idea of verifying that, but Wetley claimed that many, if not most of them, at least in Miami, were medical specimens. And he thought so because, they had, anthropological features that pointed towards Southeast Asia, South and Southeast Asia, which apparently is sort of from where there's a brisk trade in human remains for anthropological and forensic teaching purposes. But anyway, as Wetley made clear, so taking these apart yields little knowledge beyond what the state demands of the medical examiner. You will cut your hands on the razor blades in the dried up muck, which they contain, and you may be able to trace the human remains, but the rest remains a trivial, because ultimately unknowable, hybrid. No signal, all noise. To be sure, the process of montaje follows a taphonomic logic of sorts. Yet once assembled, not only is a Nganga more than the sum of its object parts, both in a material and in a relational sense, the life form, or death form, if you will, constituted by it, is a vortex that sucks up entities that ostensibly pertain to different ontological domains: matter, spirit, subjects, objects, past, present, and it fuses them into an irreducible synthetic whole beyond differentiation and analysis. So, to return to the story with which I opened this talk, were Cosme's nightmare of Adicina's grave being dug up to come true, the Nganga object that might result from such activities would, once forcefully separated, for example, through confiscation, from its human complement, that is the Palero and its cult group, it would remain as historically meaningless as any other thoroughly decontextualized container of now no longer identifiable human bones, animal carcasses, other organic matter, and a wild jumble of artifacts whose social and ritual biographies are now beyond reconstitution and reconstruction. The trata, the pact between the Nfumbi that was once Adicina and the Palero who installed him in Nganga would forever be broken. His Kiyumba cranium would revert to the status of the cranium of an unknown elderly African male. Other than for typological reasons or to document the violence that accompanied its collection, no museum would ever have to bother exhibiting it. And needless to say, of course, from the perspective of contemporary Paleros, the meaninglessness so produced would have truly horrific significance, because while Nganga objects are sometimes ritually disassembled, this really only occurs when, upon the death of their human owner, the Nfumbi expresses the wish not to enter into a relation with another member of the cult group, and instead decides to be set free into obliteration. I mean, in that case, sort of these objects are under great precautions taken apart and scattered in various ritual ways in the landscape. But if, as with all of these, objects that, the good Dr. Wetley had in his cabinets in the Miami-Dade medical examiner's office, I mean, they were, in a sense, the record of, sort of unfathomable destruction and literally noise-making from the perspective of any Palero who would have ever been admitted to this place. So, hence better dead, that is in an unmarked grave, than being fed, that is sacrificed to by a Palero, or so I imagine Cosme's reasoning might go when it comes to the remains of the likes of Adicina. Yet, what awesome powers could accrue from the possession of his skull, or even only some dirt from his grave? From a Palero's perspective, that is. What amazing compounds of spirit and matter might be mounted if one could only get access to his remains. And what a loss, or so I imagine Cosme to think, might accrue from this when it comes to the recovery, under rational socialist conditions, of the history of the Cuban nation, its subaltern classes, their African heritage, and so on and so forth. Ripped from the grave, and so forever archaeologically decontextualized, lost for the world of disciplined historical reconstruction, and re-entombed, or given a new lease on life, depending on perspective, in some Paleros Nganga object, the archaeological significance of Remigio Herrera's mortal remains would be forever lost to a contemporary process of, yes, anachronistic hybridization. That's what would have occurred from that perspective. Yet, by the same token, and from a rather different perspective, Cosme's, and implicitly the Cuban nation's loss, might be conceivable as some Paleros, and indeed Adicina's gain. Of course, one can only speculate on whether the old African sage would want to be brought back to mundane existence as a Fumbi, sharing his life with and doing the bidding of a 21st century Palero. But who am I to say? With Webb Keen, we might instead argue that this case constitutes a rather dramatic, even violent clash between two rather different semiotic ideologies articulating within the same local economy of representation. This is why I would suggest qualifying the practices of contemporary Paleros not as a form of alternative or indigenous mortuary archaeology, one that, from the perspective of conventional archaeological historicism, lamentably results in the disturbance of potential sites and so in the destruction of its future resources. Instead, it seems to me that a case could be made for such practices to constitute modernist archaeology's mirror image, an anti-archaeology of sorts. And let me briefly elaborate on this in concluding. While conventional archaeological excavations aim to methodically purify what its practitioners conceive of as a target signal from a specific past, by amplifying it over and above the temporal pile-up of object noise that surrounds it, Afro-Cuban ritual incavations, if I may call them that, proceed no less methodically in scrambling the frequencies of space and time upon which disciplined historical archaeological practice depends. Both inevitably involve a moment of creative destruction. But what is created and destroyed in the process could not be more different. If modernist archaeology may be said to have historicized and opened up to metaphorical appropriation the originally geological concept of stratification as an analytic of depth, if so, then burrowing, or bulldozing as the case may be, through surface deposits that a different research design might read as no less valid evidence of another past, then that's the price to pay for access to a target layer. I mean, it really just depends. I mean, whether you want to document, a mid-20th century parking lot or what's beneath it. Both constitute different paths, but it really sort of depends upon what aspect of the material culture in front of you you deem significant, and what other parts you deem as a signal, and what other parts you deem mere noise. In contrast, if the goal of Afro-Cuban paleros is to render the powers of the dead accessible to the living, well then, destruction of the archaeological record is the price to pay. If the careful extraction of bones of the dead or artifacts from past life worlds is to render them evidence of histories defined as significant under whatever present descriptions, then their, however methodical and well-documented disarticulation from their contemporary material context cannot be avoided. If the goal is the rearticulation, indeed animation, of just such objects within the growing, ever-emerging ritual landscapes that constitute the life worlds of present-day paleros, then the obliteration of archaeological context cannot be avoided. If the aim of modernist archaeology was, and often still is, to objectify the works of the dead as purified monuments to a bygone time, then paleros enliven and personify the mixtures they fashion from dead people's bodily remains so as to perform works for the living in the here and now. Now, this list of symmetrical contrasts could be extended. One's project of purification is the other's nightmare of inappropriate mixture. One's signal is the other's noise. And while we may be inclined to side with Cosme in his task of preserving the non-renewable resources for the Cuban nation's past and the recovery of its subaltern cultural history, we should be careful to note one final irony to do with the timing of Adicina's death. Remember, Adicina died as a free man and had been free long before the end of slavery and came to Cuba. But had he died while still a slave, his remains would have been bulldozed along with the bones of hundreds, if not thousands, of unknown other slaves when Regla's old slave cemetery made way for revolutionary Cuba's future in the form, of course, of a school which may by now actually have been closed because the building is derelict. Metaphor for revolutionary futures, perhaps. And yet, by the same token, had Adicina not died when he did in early 1905, and had he not managed during his life to build up a actually well-documented, respectable reputation and network of social patrons, chances are that he might have been swept up in the horrific campaigns against African wizardry in the service of scientific modernization that shook Cuba between the fall of 1904 and the end of the second decade of the 20th century. Like other, less fortunate elderly male practitioner of one or the other Afro-Cuban ritual tradition, he might have been accused of killing implicitly white children for occult reasons. He might have been hastily sentenced to death and garroted. His skull might then have, as happened various occasions during that time, his skull might then have been shipped off to the University of Havana, where Cuban adepts of Lombrosian criminal anthropology would, for the next decades, make signs of the bodily remains of dead black wizards, subject of my Wizards and Scientists book. Final irony. Tucked away in a small Museo de Medicina Legal in Havana's huge Calixto Garcia hospital complex, the skulls so collected at the beginning of the 20th century are still on display. The sad object evidence of the wreckage of a modernist project, a signal turned, and I think we can all agree on that, pure moral noise. Though such an outcome seems unlikely under present conditions, and regardless of whatever the Museo de Regla decides to do with Adicina's grave, perhaps someone should bribe the night watchman at Calixto Garcia and let the paleros in. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. We've got at least a good half an hour for questions and answers. Is anyone at the top of their head?
Well, thank you so much for that provocative talk. One of the themes that I kept thinking of as you were speaking was the idea of power in just the really concrete sense of subordination.
Mm-hmm.
That this is a project, the Paleros project is a project of, frankly, subordinating the dead and having them do their will. And so, of course, the whole time through, I was thinking, well, Adicino perhaps he wouldn't have liked this particular Palero, and he would have said, like, leave me alone, puny being. I'm a much greater person than you are. Who do you think you are to control me? And, the parallels with slavery, of course, are obvious. And, having lived in a place where people did dig up bones in South of the Pacific, and all the relics that I've personally seen were all matrilineal relatives, where people felt this great moral certainty that, of course, my mother or my mother's brother or whoever would want me to draw on their power to make me beautiful and irresistible and have my cooler partners become dizzy with desire. And that when when non-related people like warriors from a previous century, when their remains were dug up, sometimes people would become really alarmed. I mean, they would be scared. But I was wondering about this moral imperative here and the power differential of the living by this Palo Monte and other practices, in a sense, subordinating particular dead persons. And
Well,
agency.
I mean, there is undoubtedly, you know, and I've written about that. There's the very, very strong resonances of slavery on the one hand and wage labor as well. You know, sort of because different, for example, from traditions such as the Yoruba influenced regla de ocha, where you basically sacrifice to the deities in order to maintain a kind of gift relationship, if you will. Ngangas are remunerated. I mean, they have to be fed in order to be kept alive, so to speak, but they're remunerated after they've performed a service. So it's kind of, it's, and then you also do a whole lot of things like, you can shower them with abuse, you're supposed to heat them up into action. I mean, so you can whip them, all kinds of, call them, nasty names and whatnot, to make them angry. I mean, which is actually sort of, if you look at the, for example, Wyatt McGaffey's work on, on Western Central African Minkisi objects, not that dissimilar. But what gets rolled into one, in Cuba, but actually already with the Minkisi object, there is not necessarily a kinship relation that that is embodied in these sort of power objects that oftentimes serve that assimilate human personnel through initiation rather than through kinship and filiation. So some animal has gotten killed there, which would impart a certain kind of metaphorical flavor to the compound. I know a guy who keeps it's like a medieval alchemical pharmacy. He keeps a whole part of his house devoted to collections of sort of rare and potentially for the future significant objects that he plans to install in such objects over the course of time. Anyway, so we have these two interacting types of substances within the cauldron itself, but then more than one socially personified agent, only one of whom, namely the palero, is a human being. All the while it does so, it also scrambles Western common sense ontological divisions, such as those between persons and things, life and death, past and present. While a Nganga, for example, is fed with his owner's blood, initiation into the cult of Nganga likewise involves rubbing some of the Nganga's contents into small wounds cut into the future palero's skin. Then we also have packets attached to the outer surface of a Nganga, and these may contain further instructions concerning specific works, trabajos, that the Nfumbi is to perform at the bidding of the palero or his clients. And the residue, and it also will sort of contain the residue of animal or other sacrifices with which Nganga is remunerated for its services. And these gradually build up and often overflow the cauldron itself, spilling out into veritable ritual landscapes that can come to take up entire rooms. Traveling along and sometimes across various social pathways of valorization and appropriation, such as commodification, extraction from nature, theft, and so on, and towards their subsumption in and by the Nganga. Yet the biography they come to document is neither just one of things in social motion, nor one that merely chronicles the Nganga's owner and master's agency and mystical pursuits. It involves, now these landscapes, in a sense, have their own depositional logics and histories, and they present a materially accreting record of mystical interactions between the Nfumbi and its human master. It's kind of sort of the congealed result of an ongoing dual biography, if you will. So the resulting tableaus mall may be said to exemplify, from maybe an archaeological point of view, cultural biographies of sorts. Heterogeneous things and substances